Welcome to The Explainer. Today we are going to unpack a deeply misunderstood part of the human experience. If you've ever felt this nagging guilt just for wanting to sit on your couch, stare at the wall, and do absolutely nothing, well, you are completely in the right place. We're going to explore the incredibly fascinating neuroscience behind our deep, almost primal desire for a quiet, predictable, and totally unremarkable life. And trust me, by the end of this, you are going to see your boring routine in a completely new light.
Okay, let's dive into this. Have you ever literally made up an excuse to cancel weekend plans just so you could stay home and do nothing? Be honest, we've all been there. Society constantly, subtly conditions us to feel this creeping sense of guilt about it. You get told you lack ambition, or you're antisocial, or that you're somehow falling behind if your weekend isn't packed with highly curated trips and loud social gatherings. But what if that guilt is just a complete lie? That brings us to our first major theme. The invisible rebellion, pushing back against the attention economy.
There is this wild contrast between societal judgment and actual biology. Society might look at you and say, you're lazy, unmotivated, or antisocial. But neuroscience? It tells a completely different story. When you intentionally choose to stay in your comfiest clothes and follow your exact same mundane routine, you are absolutely not giving up on life. Actually, your brain is in an emergency survival mode. You're engaging in a highly sophisticated biological defense mechanism. You are actively rebelling against an incredibly toxic attention economy that is relentlessly trying to extract your emotional energy. Moving right along to Section 2, the overheated brain, surviving the modern world. To really get this biological defense, we have to look at what happens the absolute second you leave your house. Our modern world just pumps dopamine and cortisol into your system at violently unnatural rates. Take something as simple as going to a coffee shop. Society calls that a relaxing, low-effort activity, right? Well, for your nervous system, it's a massive, overwhelming data processing center. Your brain is rapidly tracking subtle facial expressions, filtering out incredibly loud, overlapping conversations, adjusting to harsh artificial lighting, and actively masking to ensure you appear polite. You're not just sipping a latte. Your brain is literally computing thousands of microstimuli every single second. Which leads us directly to a clinical phenomenon known as sensory overstimulation. Listen, your social battery isn't draining because you're weak. It's draining because your hardware is functioning like a high-powered computer trying to run 50 heavy applications at the exact same time. Your sympathetic nervous system, that's your primal fight-or-flight response, is staying permanently switched on. You might just be walking through a normal Tuesday, but biologically, your brain thinks it's under an invisible threat. Eventually, the hardware just starts to overheat. Powering down. When you hit that absolute wall of cognitive fatigue, you just have to retreat. Imagine that profound, heavy silence of closing your front door, turning the lock, and just sinking into your home. It isn't a lifestyle preference to want that. It is a strict biological imperative. You are finally safe to power down. And that brings us to Section 3, neurological intensive care, the science of healing. First, we've got to talk about decision fatigue. Every single trivial choice you make out in the world consumes a measurable amount of glucose right in your brain. By the afternoon, you have completely depleted your cognitive reserves. And this brilliantly illustrates why some of the most famous creative minds in history engineered incredibly boring lives. They wore the exact same clothes every day. They ate the exact same meals. They weren't lacking imagination. They were aggressively eliminating trivial decisions to protect their mental energy for high-level complex thought. But here is where it gets really fascinating. Enter the default mode network, or DMN. When you're out in the chaotic world, this network is totally suppressed because you are in strict defense mode. But the second you engage in a completely mindless, physically boring task, like folding laundry or just staring out a window, this network fiercely awakens. The DMN is literally the neurological epicenter of human creativity and emotional processing. So while society thinks you're just spacing out, your brain is actually doing its most critical, high-level processing. It's biologically impossible to understand your inner world if you're constantly reacting to the outer one. Let's look at Section 4, peace versus numbness, the dark side of solitude. Now, there's a really vital caveat to all of this. It comes down to a harsh truth that we have to ask ourselves. Are you protecting your peace, or are you just protecting your pain? Solitude is an incredibly potent medicine, but an overdose turns it right into a poison. When you spend 3 days inside, do you feel a profound sense of relief and grounding, or do you just feel this heavy apathy? Numbness is a psychological anesthetic.
If your boring life is motivated by a fear of failure or a desperate need to avoid human vulnerability, then your sanctuary has quietly morphed into a self-made prison.
So, the crucial point is how we practice the art of intentional grounding. Step 1, close the laptop. Endlessly scrolling through short-form videos isn't actually rest, it's escapism. You have to eliminate that cheap digital dopamine. Step 2, anchor back to your physical body. Do something slow and deliberately boring, like cooking a meal from scratch or tending to some plants. And step 3, allow your raw emotions to rise without immediately distracting yourself. That is how you turn a potential hiding place into a sacred, deliberate ritual of self-restoration. Which leads beautifully into section 5, the beauty of boredom, redefining intimacy and focus.
Have you ever heard of Dunbar's number? It's this evolutionary biology concept that suggests we have a hard biological limit to the number of stable, meaningful relationships we can actually maintain. Modern social media aggressively violates this rule, but craving a boring routine acts as an incredibly ruthless, highly efficient psychological filter. By refusing to participate in superficial weekend plans, you naturally starve out the energy vampires in your life. Keeping a heavily guarded, tiny microcircle isn't a lack of popularity. Psychology actually views it as the absolute pinnacle of relational intelligence.
Because really, the ultimate test of intimacy is the capacity for shared, uninterrupted silence. It is the extraordinary ability to sit in a room with someone for hours, totally absorbed in your own mundane tasks, without any of that suffocating, anxious pressure to fill the empty air with words. When you find someone whose nervous system naturally co-regulates with yours in complete silence, where you're entirely unmasked, the boredom itself actually becomes this unbreakable foundation of trust. And finally, section 6, the luxury of obscurity, the freedom of being unobserved.
Peak cognitive performance, getting into that flow state, simply cannot happen in a state of constant distraction. Building mental empires requires a rock-solid foundation of extreme, undisturbed boredom. We are falsely taught to glorify this chaotic hustle, constantly chasing titles, accumulating digital validation, and broadcasting absolutely every milestone. But the ultimate luxury? It's having the courage to just be a nobody. There is a profound, almost spiritual joy in being completely unobserved, completely free from the exhausting performance of modern identity. You don't have to earn your right to exist through constant productivity. Sitting on your couch, you are already undeniably enough.
So I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought to mull over. Are you hiding from the world, or are you finally meeting yourself? Your quiet life isn't a failure of ambition. It is a masterpiece of intentional peace. Embrace your gloriously ordinary, predictably boring days for the profound evolutionary gifts they truly are. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and honestly, I highly encourage you to go sink deeply into a beautifully boring evening. You have absolutely earned it.